Great. Hi, my name is Amy Elias, and I am the director of the UT Humanities Center. And I have the great pleasure today of welcoming you to a really special session on Big Orange Give Day. As you know, today is a day where the entire university has a giving campaign, and you can give to anyone or any department at UT. If you go to the University of Tennessee Big Orange Give website, you can give to the College of Arts and Sciences, you can give to individual departments, but you can also give to the UT Humanities Center. And we have a special Giving Day today because an anonymous donor has given us a match gift of $5,000. And what this means is that if you, what this means is that if you give today, that money will be matched, and we can have the potential to double that by the end of the day. All right. So do give. Anything is $1 is great. $100 is great. $1 million is fantastic. Whatever you want to give is terrific. But your money helps us to do a lot of the public programming that we do that you might have heard about in our last session, but also to do mentorship programs for faculty at the University of Tennessee, mentorship programs for graduate students at the University of Tennessee, and to provide things like this, which is our fellowship program for graduate students and faculty in 9 departments at the University of Tennessee. And this is a really outstanding program that has put us on a national map in terms of humanities centers and institutes, because we offer 4 graduate student fellowships, research fellowships, and 6 faculty research fellowships. And these are year-long fellowships at the Humanities Center. It's a competitive deal. People have to put in applications. Those applications are externally reviewed and ranked. And the winners of that competition get to spend a year at the Humanities Center. We give an office, we have office support, we have other kinds of support they can have, and they are released from teaching and service for that year to get their research projects done, right? It is an outstanding program that has led to grant applications for the university, that has led to award-winning publication, books, articles, and digital projects. And also, it has led to a kind of, I want to say marketability, but I don't like that word, prestige for our graduate students. We have a 98% graduation rate for the fellows that come through our program. And they graduate on time as graduate students, and they are much more likely to get great jobs on the job market because they have this fellowship experience, they've gotten their dissertations done, and they have been enabled, a kind of professional experience has been enabled for them during their fellowship year. So our fellowship program is really wonderful. And what you're going to hear today is one of our graduate student fellows giving a talk on her research expertise, the dissertation that she has in progress. So I think I'll stop there and just introduce Caitlin Branum Thrash, who is a 6th year doctoral student. She's working on her Ph.D. And she's in the Department of English. And I'm not going to summarize her project because you'll hear about it in a moment, but her project title is Books of Feminine Devotion, Female Influences on Meditative Lives of Christ and Their Readers in Late Medieval England. So with that, I think I will just let Caitlin say hello and turn it over to her.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Elias. So first, I'd like to thank the Humanities Center for supporting my research this year. I'm so grateful that I'm able to be a fellow and focus on my research. And a warm welcome also to those who are turning in via Facebook for the Big Orange Give. Your generosity supports my research and all the wonderful initiatives that are of the Humanities Center and the University of Tennessee generally. So thank you for your generosity, and I hope you consider giving if you haven't already. So I will share my screen. All right, is that working?
Yes, it is.
Excellent. So I've shortened my dissertation title for the purposes of the PowerPoint slide, as you can see, but my dissertation explores the connection between the writings of medieval visionary women, medieval retellings of the life of Christ, and readers, particularly women in late medieval England. So essentially, visionaries like Brigida of Sweden and Mechthild of Hackeborn had religious visions where Christ, the Virgin Mary, or various saints revealed select knowledge to them. These visions could include details of the holy figures' earthly lives, knowledge of the future, or effective prayers and religious practices. The visionary accounts were written down and became very popular in late medieval Europe. They circulated independently, were sometimes incorporated into devotional retellings of the life of Christ, and they were included or in excerpted form in individual devotional manuscripts. So I investigate these avenues of transmission to determine how they affected devotion to the life of Christ and to see how individuals, particularly women, encountered the text and used them in their religious practices and devotions. So in other words, I'm using the Life of Christ genre as a case study to explore the impact of female authors in England and investigate English women's book culture. So I've structured this talk to give you a little more background information on like the different parts of things that I'm bringing together in my dissertation, and then we'll move on to some examples. So first,
can I interrupt you for one moment?
Yes.
I don't know if this is working for everybody else, but your screen is just truncated a little bit.
Okay, hang on just a second. Then I'm gonna stop the share, mess with my windows, and then see how that goes.
Was that right for everyone else, or was it just?
Yeah, it's different on my computer too. So let me.
Okay. Take your time.
Let's see. All right. I think I've got it. I want this one. Okay. So is that, hang on.
That's much better.
That's much better. Okay.
Terrific.
All right. So the way that I've switched it around, my notes are now not on the same screen as my webcam. So let me see if I can do.
This is great. What I think everybody's learning is how much technology we have to know just to do the research presentations we did.
If I didn't have my two monitors, I would be totally lost, but that means I have to do some shuffling. Okay, so you can see the whole Brigida of Sweden slide. If I look at my notes, you can see my face straight on. We're good, right?
We're good.
Excellent. All right, then, Brigida of Sweden. She was a Swedish noblewoman. She was born in 1302 or 1303 in Uppland, Sweden. She married Ulf Gudmarsson in 1316. She had 8 children with him. Ulf died in the mid-1340s, and soon after, Brigida experienced a calling vision to become the sponsa et canale, or the sponse and channel of Christ. She spent the rest of her life as a holy woman, recording her visions with the help of her confessors, establishing her monastic rule, and making pilgrimages to Rome and Jerusalem. She died in 1373, and she was canonized in 1391. Her rule and her visionary texts gained great popularity throughout Europe, and there are at least 180 Latin manuscripts of various redactions of her text. That's a lot. So in England, in particular, Brigida's popularity was enhanced by the establishment of Sion Abbey, the only Brigittine monastery in England in 1415. Henry V established it along with the Carthusian Sheen Monastery, and Sion quickly became one of the richest and most visited monastic houses in England. Sion was a double order focused on contemplation with 60 sisters, 13 priests, 4 deacons, and 8 lay brothers. It quickly became known as a nexus of books and texts with a particular focus on mystical and religious works, which is appropriate considering its mystical patron saint. Brigida's text also circulated in England outside of Sion. There are several Latin manuscripts of English origin that contain the revelations, and we know of 2 full Middle English manuscript translations. And they also circulated widely in excerpt. So that's our first mystic. Our second mystic is Mechthild of Hackeborn. She was a 13th century visionary nun at the Benedictine Cistercian monastery of Helfta in Germany. This monastery was known as a center of women's learning and mysticism because aside from Mechthild herself, it provided shelter for another visionary also named Mechthild, Mechthild of Magdeburg, who's known for her vernacular flowing light of the Godhead. And it was home to Mechthild of Hackeborn's mystical successor, Gertrude the Great. Mechthild's book, the Liber Specialis Gratiae, or LSG, was secretly composed by her sisters from Mechtild's accounts of her visions. The original Latin text consists of 7 parts and was completed shortly after Mechtild's death in 1298. Because of its orthodoxy and its compelling images of heavenly glory, intimacy with Christ, and the Sacred Heart of God, it was very popular in late medieval Europe. It came to England in the early 15th century, largely through textual exchange networks among the Carthusians. It was very popular at Sion Abbey, and it spread through their extensive textual network. So there is a Middle English translation of the LSG called the Book of Ghostly Grace, which translates the abridged version of Mechtild's work and contains only 5 parts. So there's our female mystics. So let's talk about devotional lives of Christ. So over the course of the Middle Ages, Christians increasingly concentrated on the life and particularly the passion of Christ as a focus for private devotion, prayer, and corporate religious practice. This fascination with the incarnation, the passion, and the Virgin makes appearances in most genres of medieval art and literature: iconography, sculpture, paintings, manuscript illustrations, liturgical writings, hymns, sermons, poetry, philosophical writings, visionary texts, and works made for private prayer and devotion. So it was everywhere. As Ian Johnson says, Christ's life was the model for all human conduct and self-understanding. Christ was the basis, means, and end of human identity, ethics, happiness, self-understanding, and all meaningfulness in life and beyond. So the Life of Christ genre began as gospel harmonies for those who were studying scripture. So that's where they took the narratives of the gospels and kind of put them in order to make a single narrative. They then started adding material from the Old Testament and apocryphal material, and eventually works on the life of Christ became more meditative and effective, with apocryphal material and performative cues added specifically to increase the emotional response of the reader. In England, as in the rest of Europe, there are many iterations of this devotional genre, both in Latin and in the vernacular. So for the purposes of my project, though, the Life of Christ genre refers to the meditative branch of these related texts because they share a meditative and effective purpose, as well as a joint concentration on the life of humanity of Christ. These meditative lives of Christ were very popular in late medieval England, with its most prominent member, Nicholas Love's Mirror of the Blessed Life of Jesus Christ, extant in almost 50 manuscripts. The preponderance of these texts in late medieval English culture reflects the incredible proliferation of devotion to the life and humanity of Christ in late medieval England. And then finally, the last piece of my kind of like dissertation puzzle is medieval women and their literacy and book culture. So first, the ideas of literacy, book ownership, and writing were vastly different in the Middle Ages than they are today. And these ideas also changed over the course of the medieval period because it's 1,000 years. Changes in time, technology, and culture impacted how medieval people wrote, read, and produced books. And throughout that time, wider cultural elements such as class, gender, and education also affected individuals and their ability with reading and writing in various languages. In general, though, when one thinks about medieval literacy, one must remember that reading and writing were not necessarily commensurate skills. And also one must remember that when medieval scholars are talking about literacy, they are specifically thinking about Latin literacy, not the ability to read and or write in the vernacular. So therefore, we have to differentiate between Latin and vernacular literacy, as well as abilities to read and or write. So in the early medieval period, Lisa M.C. Weston tells us that substantial evidence reveals Anglo-Saxon monastic women as active and engaged readers of both sacred scripture and contemporary writers. Stephanie Hollis says that there's evidence for cathedral schools at Barking, Nunnaminster, and Wilton, so these are nunneries, in the 10th and 11th centuries, suggesting that women's education was more widespread at this time. In the late medieval period, so that's like the 13th through the 15th centuries, there's more evidence for women's literacy, but less for their Latinity. Felicity Riddy, Catherine Innes Parker, Alexandra Barrett, and others have identified many devotional texts in the vernacular written for a female audience. These works reflect a general assumption that women could read in the vernacular. Late medieval nuns in particular had a good reputation for this vernacular literacy, and they were somewhat voracious readers. There's also some evidence that late medieval nuns could write both in Latin and in the vernacular. Veronica O'Mara has identified a particularly prolific female scribe at Sion, Mary Neville, who we'll see more about later, who wrote in both Latin and in Middle English. So in examining household accounts for English nunneries, Marilyn Oliva has found that nuns could write and reckon accounts for their own use, and that multiple nuns, the cellarists, the treasuress, and other nuns with administrative positions took part in the recording process. So this would indicate that nuns wrote for pragmatic purposes, such as keeping records, signing their names, and other similar practical concerns. So that's our background. And here are the central questions that I'm trying to kind of answer with my dissertation. So number one, how do the texts of continental female mystics and devotion to the life of Christ relate to one another? Number two, how are the texts of holy women incorporated into meditative lives of Christ? Number three, what do English women themselves want out of devotional lives of Christ in their own practices and reading and all of that kind of stuff? And then finally, how do English women use the texts of continental holy women? So I have an example for each of these questions. So first, let's look at the relationship of mystical women and devotion to the life of Christ in general. So London, British Library manuscript Sloane 982 is a 15th century paper manuscript that chiefly contains excerpts from the Liber Celestis of Brigida of Sweden, supplemented by excerpts from Mechthild of Hackeborn, Catherine of Siena, St. Anselm, and other religious treatises, but it's mostly Brigida of Sweden. While much of the content is in Latin, two passages, one from Catherine of Siena and one from Mechthild, are in Middle English. It's in the same hand throughout, which means that it was likely composed at one time by the same kind of group of people or the same person. And there's not much decoration in this manuscript, although it does have highlighting in red ink and some red letters in the text. It has an interesting feature of occasional leaves, which are smaller than the normal pages, added in. So you can see a picture of this on the slide, which appear to be additional excerpts, which the creator found later and wanted to add into a certain section. So he said, you know, I missed a spot. I'm going to go put it in on this little page. These additional leaves are in a contemporary hand, and they usually lack the red highlighting of the main pages. And there are also extensive marginal notes in various hands throughout the manuscript, some with underlining in red. They serve several purposes. Sometimes they summarize the excerpted text. Sometimes they categorize the purpose of the revelation in the main part of the page. And at some points, there are numerals for different points in the text. And occasionally they add in like a reference to something else. So between the extensive marginal notes, the general wear on the paper, and the additional pages, this manuscript seems to have been in heavy use despite its lack of grandeur. It's a clerical miscellany, and it's less organized than some other Bergantine manuscripts I've seen because many of the excerpts aren't labeled with the citation for the original revelation. So a lot of Bergantine manuscripts will have like Liber 1, chapter 10 or something like that. And Sloane 982 doesn't have that, which is actually incredibly frustrating for me. But there are some headings and marginal notes which describe the contents of the passage on a particular page, such as like De Sacerdotibus, written in the top margin of folio 32b, which is not the folio here. Many of the revelations included in this manuscript have to do with clerics behaving badly, spiritual advice for clerics and lay people, and visions of judgment. But the part that I wanted to talk about here is the Passion Meditation in Sloane 982, which has a distinct layout from the sheer amount of red ink on the page, which you can see. In the top right and left margins of the pages, there's a large IHC inscription in red ink, that's for Jesus, with a large Virgo Maria Mater Dei in the bottom margin. These inscriptions are in that Gothic display script, which is much more formal than the Anglicana cursive hand of the main text, so you can see the difference in the hands there. And there are also many rubrics in red ink in the main text because the meditation is divided into articles which each have a rubric. And then you've got the red underlining and paragraph marks. So the overall impression of the pages is that they're soaked in red, perhaps evoking Christ's blood as it spilled in the Passion Meditation. This decorative scheme, which represents the only real program of decoration in Sloane 982, indicates that the Passion Meditation was considered an important genre of revelations on the part of the holy women, and that it may have had a different use for the readers of the manuscript. While it may have been used for reference, as the rest of the manuscript seems to have been, the additional decorative elements imply that the Passion Meditation in particular may have had devotional purpose for the clerics themselves to turn to. So we can see that the texts of holy women and Passion devotion to the life of Christ are indeed related. So next, we'll look at an example of how female mystical texts are incorporated into formal lives of Christ. The Speculum Devotorum, or A Mirror to Devout People, is a 15th century Middle English meditative life of Christ composed between 1430 and 1450. It was compiled at the Carthusian House of Jesus of Bethlehem at Sheen, and it's one of many meditative lives of Christ that circulated in late medieval Europe. The compiler addresses the entire text to a ghostly sister who is most likely a nun of Sion Abbey. It differs from similar lives of Christ because it uses the texts of female mystics as sources. The anonymous compiler incorporates material from and about Brigida of Sweden, Machteld of Hackeborn, Catherine of Siena, and Elizabeth of Hungary. So in looking at how he incorporates them, I have found that the status of female authority in the Speculum Devotorum demonstrates the complicated authority of female mystics within medieval culture, occupying a middle ground between celebration and caution. The compiler's selections from female sources focus on virginity, discernment of spirits, female praise, maternal love, and compassion, which were areas of particular interest about and for medieval women. So when he includes female sources in his work, he imbues them with the full authority of divinely inspired medieval authors. However, his compilatory strategy indicates that he limits female mystics to being authorities on what he considers to be female concerns. So let's look at an example to see what I mean here. The first chapter that contains Bergantine material is chapter 5, the Nativity, which contains details about the birth of Christ from Mary's point of view. The compiler introduces Brigida as an auctor with exclusive knowledge at the beginning of the passage. So he says, "Yet more openly how our Lord was born and all the manner thereof, Our Lady showed to Saint Birgit full fair by revelation, the which say she telleth thus." So then you get the recounting of the birth, which is narrated from Brigida's perspective as a witness. First, the Virgin prepares herself in the space for the arrival of a child, removing her shoes and outer clothing and laying out cloths with which she will wrap the infant Jesus. These practical nuances of childbirth are topics that one experienced medieval mother like Brigida with her 8 children would share with another. So after this comes the birth itself. When all this was thus already, then the Virgin kneeled down with great reverence, putting herself to prayer, and she stood as though she had been left up into the ecstasy or surrounding of contemplation, filled with ghostly sweetness. And as she stood so in prayer, he saith then the child moving in her womb, and anon in a moment in the stroke of an ear, she brought forth a son, of the which came out so unspeakable light and brightness, and that manner bringing forth was so sudden and in so short a time due, that he might not perceive ne discern how or in what member she brought forth child. So we could tell a few things from this passage. The compiler's framing of Brigida's vision of the Nativity from his introduction and his focus on the details of the birth demonstrates that he is chiefly interested in Brigida's authorial connection to maternal information, rather than encouraging the reader to concentrate on the parallel mystical experiences of the saint and the Mother of God. Mary's painless, instantaneous childbirth is described as a mystical episode. Instead of suffering the pangs of childbirth, Mary enters a state of divine rapture, while the infant Christ emerges from her with such unspeakable light and brightness that Brigida can't quite discern how it happens. So even though Brigida gets a privileged view of the miraculous birth of Christ, some things remain a mystery. Brigida's shared status with Mary as a visionary and a mother allows her special access to episodes from Mary's life that mirror Brigida's own experience. However, the compiler chooses to involve Brigida's text at a moment when the feminine concerns of childbirth and maternal love are paramount. While this does acknowledge Brigida's expertise in these matters, it also grounds Brigida's authority in her gender. So in contrast to this, we can look at a Middle English life of Christ written by a woman. So the Festus and Passion of our Lord Jesus Christ only exists in one manuscript. That's Oxford Bodleian Library manuscript Holcomb Miscellany 41. This small yet deluxe manuscript dates to the first half of the 15th century. There's a debate about where the text originated, with some scholars claiming that it comes from Sion Abbey and others arguing that it could have come from another female religious community in England. There are no direct references to Brigida or Machteld in this manuscript, though I think Machteld may be the indirect source for one of the passages within it. Regardless of its origin, it's unusual because of the explicit female authorship. So the telling passage occurs on 3R, which is not the page here, but it reads, "O mein sister, pray my Lord God the Trinity, that for his great bounty and endless mercy, have mercy and pity on me sinful, and make me a good woman." So that's how you know that it's a female author. It's also notable because it focuses on Jesus' encounters with women throughout the text. So Festus uses the form of prayer and the familiar narrative of Christ's life to ground the reader as it guides her toward the possibility of a mystical encounter with Christ. Because the structure and action of prayer becomes the material component of the work, the female voice, that of the author, the reader, the various characters in the text, and the voices of the female monastic community, becomes the link that draws the reader into mystical experience. So each chapter of the work relates an incident from Christ's life followed by a prayer, and therefore each chapter works as an individual devotional exercise for the reader if she wants to use it that way. So let's look at one of these. All right. Christ's first encounter with a regular woman, meaning like not the Virgin Mary or a saint, is the Samaritan woman at the well. It's an episode that echoes both baptism and the Eucharist with its references to the water of life. So it starts, O Jesu full of benignity, yelled your thankings that ye so make and meekly spak a good will with the woman Samaritan that come to the well there ye sat to fetch water. And ye benign Jesu bade her give your drink and said to her, who that drank the water of life that ye given, that they should not thirst in perpetually. For the water, ye said, is the well that him shall lead to everlasting life. And thus full homely ye spak with her a good will and told her private secrets. So, though the only direct quote in the passage is Jesus describing the water of life, the passage is bracketed by descriptions of his conversation with the woman. The prayer at the end of the passage echoes the encounter by asking the Lord to come into me soul, tell and show me the darkhead default that privily lurking within me. Suffer me not to mock virtue of vice, nay of vice virtue, void from me all evil customs, and give me clear sight of true understanding and soothfast knowing, so that he may fully amend me of all mean defaulters. So the emphasis on conversation with Jesus about the woman's sin in both the description of the event and in the prayer that the woman reader prays encourages the reader to put herself into the place of the Samaritan woman and discuss her faults with Jesus. The prayer's request for clear sight and true understanding could indicate a mystical insight that might be received through such an encounter. In the final prayer in the passage, which reads, Ah, gracious Jesu, grant me also the water of life, that I thirst not endlessly, and make me to drink in your sweet love, wherethrough I may at last come to everlasting life, cements the connection between the reader and the Samaritan woman, for it echoes her words from the scriptural passage. While the passage allows the reader to embody the Samaritan woman's encounter with Christ, it also draws on the sacramental reminders of Christ's salvation for the reader with the reference to the water of life, bringing to mind the reader's baptism. By creating a feedback loop of the reader's inner and outer voicing of the text, the episode from Christ's life, and the reader's own experiences, the author creates the possibility for a mystical encounter with the divine for the reader. So, we've seen that women influenced Lives of Christ in late medieval England, and that women wanted slightly different things from Lives of Christ than were often incorporated by male compilers. So I want to conclude by looking at how English women encountered the texts of holy women in their own books. So, in the last chapter of my dissertation, through surveying manuscripts that were both owned by medieval women and contained the texts of Brigida of Sweden and Maxtell of Hackeborn, I made several discoveries about how English women encountered and made use of the texts of these continental holy women. English women were much more likely to own books which excerpt from the large texts of Mechthild and Brigida than copies of their entire works. While it can't be said that women, especially nuns in places like the Brigittine Sion Abbey, did not have access to the whole of Brigida's or Mechthild's texts, their own books tended to contain only small, useful selections. They were also more likely to encounter these texts in vernacular translations than in Latin, though this wasn't always the case, as we'll see. English women used the texts of these continental mystical women to advance their own individual aims and interests, though these interests center on personal religious devotion. Specifically, I found that women used excerpts from Brigida of Mechthild as sources of prayer, for material on Christ's life and passion, and for spiritual guidance. So today we'll look at an example of a prayer from Mechthild of Hackeborn in a book owned and written by a Sion nun. And this is the cover of the book, which is quite lovely. So Lambeth Palace Library Manuscript 3600 is a fascinating manuscript because it was copied almost entirely by a female scribe. This is Mary Neville, who I mentioned earlier. She was the chantress at Sion Abbey in the early 16th century before the dissolution of the monasteries in 1539. She didn't leave a signature in this manuscript, but she can be identified by her distinctive Gothic textura hand, which you can see here. Among many other prayers, this manuscript contains a Latin version of Mechtilde's prayer, which I call the Commendation of the Senses, which begins, Laudo benedico et glorifico et saluto dulcissimum cor tuum Jesu fidelissime amator meus, which is, in English, I praise, commend, and glorify and greet your Swedish heart, Jesus, my most faithful lover. So the prayer goes on to commend each of the 5 senses to Christ and ends with a commendation of the reader's heart to Christ. It's interesting for several reasons. First, a woman chose this prayer from a mystical woman for her own devotions. So this shows that women were interested in the texts of female authors in their own devotional practice, which partially answers my last research question. Mechtilde was very popular at Sion, but this prayer in this manuscript enables the reader to directly emulate a mystical woman's intimate relationship with Christ. Second, the prayer is in Latin, when we know that the book has a female creator and audience. This suggests that some women had a greater facility with Latin than scholars generally presume. Mary Neville's office at Sion may have marked her as an outlier for this because she was responsible for the women's liturgical manuscripts at Sion, which would have been entirely in Latin. So she may have been sort of an outlier with her Latin knowledge, but it's still really interesting that it's in Latin in the first place. And finally, this prayer appears not only in this manuscript, but in 2 other manuscripts owned by women. These manuscripts are London British Library manuscript Harley 494, which was owned by 2 women named Anne Bulkley, and Trinity College Cambridge manuscript 0174, which was owned by a nun. So as far as I know, this selection appears only in women's manuscripts. It kind of puts together several selections from different places in Mechtilde's LSG, and they appear linked in all of these manuscripts, but I haven't seen it put together quite this way anywhere else. And so it's interesting that it sort of appears only in these kind of linked manuscripts. And it indicates that there could be a network of textual transmission particular to women in medieval England for Mechtilde of Hackeborn. So let's see, here we go. So to conclude, I want to return to my central questions. So we've seen from these examples that the texts of continental female mystics and devotion to the life of Christ are related to some extent. So the texts of holy women are selectively incorporated into meditative lives of Christ in ways that reflect the general caution about holy women in late medieval England. Thirdly, English women seem to want relatable points of connection in their lives of Christ that enable divine connection from their devotional lives of Christ. And that wasn't necessarily available from all of them. And then finally, English women use the texts of continental holy women in their own private devotions separately from life of Christ devotion. So, though by necessity, my research here is rather particularly focused on mystical women and lives of Christ, I hope that I've demonstrated how investigations into popular culture and everyday objects can reveal new and interesting information about medieval life. The Middle Ages are often characterized as a strange and foreign historical period, and we sometimes forget that it was inhabited by real people who left real artifacts behind. So while visions of the life of Christ and biblical fan fiction are admittedly strange on the outset, taking a closer look at the texts and the material objects demonstrates how they echoed in the lives of ordinary people. Thank you.
That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thanks.
So many things to talk about. I'm just going to let everyone, those of you who are with us today, what we usually do is we have a presentation by one of our scholars, and then we have a chat about it. The people in this room are from very different disciplines and very different fields. So Caitlin has a chance to talk to people outside her own specialization and see, what kind of insights and comments and, effects her research generates. So I'll open it up for questions at this point. Yes, Alyssa, go ahead.
Yeah, Caitlin, great job. It's a fascinating project. I have so many questions for you that we're going to have to talk about later. But I have one in particular, the last text that you brought up, the prayer from Mechtilde, LPL 3600. Yeah. You mentioned that she wrote in Latin and it was interesting. I'm just wondering, is there some sort of meaning that you find behind that? Like, is it showing more of a divine devotion if it's written in Latin rather than the vernacular? Or what your take is on that?
I think it's prayers often, especially, are in Latin in women's manuscripts more so than anything else, and I think it's sort of a echo of like, you know, scripture would be in Latin, and so like the efficacy of your prayer, if you translated it, might not work as well as if you leave it in the original text. And so, you know, I would say all medieval people would have known like the Pater Noster and the Ave Maria in Latin. And so if you get a text for a prayer that's already in Latin, you're probably going to want to preserve it as much as you can. And so it's yeah, it's interesting that it's in Latin. I think it's not unusual that she would want to preserve it rather than translate it so that maybe she could understand it in the vernacular. But the fact that she, you know, I don't think necessarily because she copied it and she chose it and all of that kind of stuff, it wouldn't just be like she's wrote saying these Latin words sort of like not understanding what they meant. So does that answer your question?
No, that I find that fascinating.
Mhm.
That, you know, the keeping the Latin is so significant, and not translating things, because today all we want to do is make things in
Right.
the vernacular. So it's great. Thank you.
Yeah, Megan, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Caitlin. This was a wonderful presentation. And I have a lot of questions, but I'll try to limit myself to just one. So one of the impressions that I've had of especially medieval women's religiosity and the kind of mysticism that you're talking about is that that could be in some context threatening to the church, you know, as it is defined through a lot of male authorities. And you're talking about these texts that women were writing and reading and sharing. So my question is sort of how the religious institutions of this time in England, you know, were responding to these texts, whether you have a sense of that from the historical record, because that was one of the many questions that came to mind is what, you know, were these subversive practices, were they recognized that way, or were the women involved of such you know, a high status perhaps that they were able to get away with it? So I would be interested to hear more of your thoughts on that.
That's a great question, and you've stumbled upon like a whole branch of research into these women. So there's a lot there, and if you're more interested, I can give you some sources to read. But basically, so the women that I'm talking about here were sort of approved by the church. Brigida was sainted, Saint Catherine of Siena was sainted. Mechtild wasn't ever officially sainted, but she was kind of like widely approved by the church. So usually when you had a sort of mystical woman, she would have a cleric, like a confessor or a priest or somebody who would kind of like help her write down all of her sources, translate it into Latin if it needed to be translated. And all of that sort of would come together in the canonization process, and she would thereby gain sort of approval of the church. And so it wouldn't necessarily be subversive at that point because she would be a saint. There's some fiddly bits with that. I read an article recently that was talking about how they're characterized as authors, right? Because they wrote down their revelations, but they're also characterized as prophets, which means that they have like prophetic authority rather than authority through the church, so that they can teach men rather than, you know, being sort of like breaking the rules, right? Because women weren't supposed to teach. If a woman wasn't sainted or wasn't sort of approved by the church, that's when you got into like the subversive sort of risky stuff. And in fact, there were several women, especially kind of like later on in the medieval period, who were executed or burned at the stake or something like that because their visions and such weren't approved. They were declared heretics and then they were executed. So I think Marguerite Porete maybe is one of these. She's not one of my like main mystics, and so if I've gotten that wrong, there are several Marguerites. But so the really popular ones tended to be the saints, sort of for that reason. But you've stumbled upon, yes, it was a very sort of like fraught situation.
Thank you so much. That's a great answer.
Yeah, thank you.
Robert's put in a question in the chat. Robert, you have a mask on, so I don't know if you're able to ask it. Do you want to ask the question? You want me to ask the question? I'll read it for him and he can pop in. Okay, great. Robert says he's in an archive and so he can't take his mask out.
Excellent.
He's in process, right? He's
Well, thanks for tuning in when you're in the archives. I'm flattered.
Yeah, that's amazing. So he says, I'm really impressed by your rich and thoughtful interpretation of these different texts. Do you bring in any material or non-textual sources to understand the world of medieval women? To what extent can objects and art shed light on these questions you raise?
Okay. So I'll answer the second part of this question first, which is, can objects and art shed light on these questions I raise? Absolutely. I totally think they can. They're a wonderful source of knowledge and all of that kind of stuff. But I don't bring them into my dissertation, partially because of scope, and partially because as a literary scholar, I don't feel like I have quite the expertise to bring in like art and objects beyond just sort of like gestures. So some of my manuscripts occasionally do have like pictures and illuminations and things like that, and I love to bring them in if I can. But in general, I focus on sort of like the textual objects, the manuscripts themselves. That said, the sort of physical material details of the manuscripts are something that I lean on a lot in my research. So looking at differences in hands, how they lay out the page, all of that kind of stuff. And I think that sort of leans on the objects side of things more so than just the text alone. So I sort of mentioned that when we were looking at that first manuscript example with all of the red ink on the page. That's sort of an example of what I'm doing in my dissertation as far as sort of like materialistic studies and things like that. But it is very like text centered, I would say. So I know that there are plenty of people who are doing sort of more like art historical and object studies, and I think it's great.
Yeah, Mary.
Hi, Caitlin, first, that was great. That was incredibly impressive, taking questions like a pro, dealing with technological hiccups, and just fascinating research. So really well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, just great. I was wondering, this might be, as an art historian, too kind of in the trenches of the material. Do you know what that red ink is made out of? Or like what they're dealing with kind of physically?
In specific, no.
Okay.
But I do know that there are a couple of different red inks. And so like some of them, I think from like earlier in the medieval period would have had like some sort of silver compound in them. And so they would have like, they sort of oxidize over time and turn black. And so when you're sort of in the archive, you can look at it and see and say like, oh, this used to be red, but now it's this sort of silvery gray color. This one would not be made out of that. And it's, when you look at it in person, it's sort of a like orangey red, and it sits like paint on the page, more so than the black ink, which does have, they use like iron gall and stuff to make it so it does sort of like burn into the page a little bit more. And so the red ink would have, I'm not sure exactly what it's made of, but I do know that it's sort of materially different, and sort of comes up off of the page a little bit more than anything else. So I hope I answered your question to even like a little extent.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And was it Mary Neville you were talking about who had the recognizable hand?
Yeah.
I have to say, just from the art historical corner, like whether it's dissertation or subsequent book, getting into these questions of style, I think will light the art historical world up. So I would encourage you to keep going with that. It's just fascinating.
Thank you.
Could I just ask Mary, because I think this is such an interesting question. Mary, could you say to us why you asked that question? Because I think that's so interesting.
I'm interested in the ways, and this is, again, I'm not a medievalist. I think I've taken one class, but in the physical nature of those books, especially when they're talking about childbirth and coming in with red, what the stakes of red would have been. Also, this is getting really particular, but where the people who made that ink lived, because I know kind of historically people who dealt with dyes were not allowed into the community proper because it was seen as a form of alchemy that was suspect. So I think that as much as our disciplines now want to pull like the material away from the literary, I wonder whether the medieval world would have done that. Especially, I mean, am I correct that it's vellum that they would have been writing on, that we're talking about skin?
In my period, the like 14th and 15th centuries, it's sort of vellum was still definitely in use, but there was also paper. And so some of my manuscripts are vellum and some of them are paper. And generally vellum is used for sort of the higher order manuscripts. So like liturgical manuscripts, fancy stuff. Whereas a lot of my sort of like personal prayer books and stuff are more likely to be on paper.
Okay. Yeah, I would, whether, again, it's the last thing you want to hear when you're writing a dissertation, right? Like there's this whole field you should explore. But I think getting into the physical nature of these books and the social relations behind their creation will only complement the excellent work that you're already doing. So Monica, does that answer your question?
Yes, and thank you so much, because that just added a whole new dimension to the way I was thinking about this talk. Thank you.
Of course.
Well, I'm going to pop in with a question of my own, Caitlin, because, well, yeah, I thought that was utterly fascinating, particularly if it's got iron oxide in the red and it turns brown, just like blood would, right? That's the same process. But my question is very different. As you know, I'm in the contemporary period. I think I took 14 credits of Latin in grad school, but that was 400 years ago, and I went into American literature, so I have like no relevant. But one thing you said at the end of your talk really made my ears perk up, which was you called it devotional fan fiction. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was fascinating because it seems to be in tension with the serious religious devotional aspect of these texts, right? The women say these prayers because they want to participate in the life of Christ, right? They want to have a deep religious experience. But at the same time, they are sort of following other women on Twitter, right? Like they're kind of doing that. So could you talk about that tension and this notion of it being devotional fan fiction a little bit?
Yeah, so the devotional fan fiction bit sort of specifically refers to those lives of Christ. So the most popular one is the Meditationes Vitae Christi, which is a sort of Franciscan influenced retelling of the life of Christ, but it has all, they tend to have these sort of directions for the reader. So, you know, as the Holy Family flees into Egypt, you go along with them and like offer to help carry the infant Christ and give Mary a break. Or, you know, weep with Mary at the foot of the cross, and all of that kind of stuff. And so to me, it's like, well, this is like self-insert fan fiction where, you know, you put yourself into the events of, you know, this thing that you're really excited about, that you care a lot about, all of that sort of thing. And it's designed for that sort of like emotional response. And also the fact that they're adding in material from the Old Testament and apocryphal material and, you know, visions that these women are having. You know, it's like, oh, I found this, you know, new bit of information that is so cool. And like, you know, Brigida over here had this vision of the nativity and, you know, baby Jesus was shining brighter than the candle that Joseph had put on the wall. And like, isn't that just the neatest thing ever? And so they are sort of having this, like, it's almost like a fan community, right? Where they're sort of bringing in, I found this little tidbit, isn't it awesome? And so it's sort of this, you know, novelty seeking, like, you know, the scripture is the scripture, it's, you know, untouchably holy and all this kind of stuff. But also we're going to have, you know, this new life of Christ that has this new detail that you haven't seen before. And so that part of it really is fascinating to me. And it's sort of like reciprocal, right? So like Brigida has all of these visions about the life of Christ, but like some of the details that she involves also kind of echo like the Meditationes Vitae Christi, or, you know, something like that. So she's familiar with the material, and it's sort of like reflexively is involved with each other.
Fascinating, really fascinating. Do we have any more? We're working you hard, Caitlin. Do we have any more questions for her today? Well, thank you. That was just an utterly fabulous talk. The research is so rich and deep and wonderful. I can see the important implications of this work already. Thank you for sharing it with us. It was just fantastic. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you so much, everybody.
And for those who are watching, I would let you know, this is the kind of work, right? This is the kind of work that our students do at the University of Tennessee in the arts and humanities, right? This is an English major, right? Who is working on incredibly difficult texts in multiple languages, going to archives to all around the world to look at the original manuscripts and then putting that together in a new interpretation, right, of medieval women's devotional writing. So just astounding kinds of work that our graduate students, right, are doing at the University of Tennessee. We have a session at 1 o'clock where you can join us again on Zoom at this link, or excuse me, on Facebook, and hear us talk about our digital humanities and environmental humanities initiatives at the University of Tennessee. Monica, did you want to say something?
Just very quickly, sorry, I did want to mention that tonight we have a public books circle event with Professor Bob Bast of the History Department, and he's going to be talking about a really interesting new interpretation of the Reformation. So if that interests you, which I know it does interest a great deal of people, please join us this evening at 7 p.m. Thank you.
That was Monica Black, the Associate Director of the UT Humanities Center, and she will be hosting the Public Book Circle meeting tonight at 7 p.m. You can see the link and register at our UT Humanities Center website. It's going to be a great book. I was going to mention it, Monica, but I'm so glad you did. This is The Verge, Reformation, Renaissance in 40 Years That Shook the World, 1490 to 1530 by Patrick Wyman, who has a very famous podcast about this book. And I think we have more than 35 people registered for this discussion already. So it should be a rocking time. I hope you can join us. So thank you, everyone. I hope to see you later. Thank you again, Caitlin, for that absolutely stunning presentation and work. Thanks for joining us.